Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly massive, incredibly ambitious, and, honestly, ultimately disastrous 19th century engineering feat. We're looking at a project that promised to completely change the map of America, sparked some wild political dreams, and ended up leaving behind a trail of mud, sweat, and sheer financial ruin.
To understand the sheer scale of this dream, I want you to try and wrap your head around this number: 468 miles. That is the staggering length of what became America's longest canal system. The Wabash and Erie Canal was designed to stretch all the way from the Great Lakes in Toledo, Ohio, clear down to the Ohio River in Evansville, Indiana. It was, essentially, supposed to be the ultimate superhighway of its day.
Okay, let's dive into this, because that massive dream, that 468-mile waterway we just talked about, ultimately collapsed, and it left the state of Indiana with an unbelievable $18 million debt. I mean, that is a sum so massive for an early 19th century frontier state that the bankruptcy was just completely devastating. It was actually so bad that the General Assembly passed legislation forbidding the state to ever go into debt again. So, you might be wondering, how does such a grand vision turn into such a monumental failure?
Well, to answer that, we're grounding our explainer today in the meticulous archival reporting of local historian Dorothy Clark. Digging through old newspapers and records, Clark really peeled back the lofty political hype to reveal the gritty, exhausting, and sometimes downright absurd reality of what it actually took to build and run this massive ditch.
Act 1. The Grand Illusion. Let's set the scene back in the late 1820s and 30s. Politicians are giving grand speeches, right? Congress is donating hundreds of thousands of acres of land just to fund the project. Land speculators are basically having a field day, platting out brand new towns along the proposed route before a single shovel has even hit the dirt. It was this time of pure, unadulterated frontier optimism, but it was completely divorced from the harsh realities of the Indiana wilderness.
But you can't build a canal with political speeches. You have to pivot from those grand dreams in the State House right down to the mud on the ground. And that brings us to the legions of laborers. These were mostly Irish, German, and Yankee workers who actually had to dig this massive trench, and get this, entirely by hand. The reality of this construction is fascinatingly primitive. I mean, this was way before diesel-powered earth movers. This supposed modern marvel was built using techniques that had barely improved since ancient Egypt. The work was broken down into 1-mile sections. Men used picks and shovels, literally hauling dirt away in wheelbarrows or mule carts. And for a standard wage of just $1 a day, these laborers lived in rude shanties, surviving mostly on a diet of bread, potatoes, and black coffee. But here is where the frontier economy gets truly fascinating, and honestly, kind of amusing. Because the work was so brutal, cash alone just wasn't enough to keep a workforce. Contractors had to provide the jigger. So a jigger was a ration of about 2 swallows of whiskey. The agreement on exactly how many jiggers a man got per day, which was usually somewhere between 5 to 10, was just as important as his actual wages. These construction sites relied heavily on the jigger boy, whose sole, highly important job was to make sure the specified amount of whiskey was delivered to the workers exactly on time, all throughout the day.
Misery on the water. Fast forward to the early 1850s, and the canal is finally operating. The sweat and the whiskey have actually left behind a functioning waterway. But I want you to imagine what it was actually like to be a passenger on one of these canal boats. It was supposed to be this smooth, luxurious ride right through the Midwest. The reality, however, was miserable. Take this incredible first-hand account of an English traveler named Mr. Bestie in 1850. He was riding from Terre Haute, and he just completely complained of the horrible food, the raw beef steak, and a literally murderous attack upon the mosquitoes that swarmed the inside of their berths. He noted that the more they killed, the more seemed to come, basically resigning his entire family to a completely sleepless night on the water. It brilliantly illustrates the reality versus the dream of canal travel.
The nightmare of operation. You see, passenger discomfort from mosquitoes and bad cornbread was the absolute least of the state's worries, because as soon as the canal opened, a bizarre, relentless series of operational failures immediately began to plague the project. I'm talking about a complete and utter logistical nightmare. Let's look at this cascade of calamities. First, grass grew so lushly in the canal bed that they had to use actual marine mowers with 12 scythes just to shear it like a lawn. But then, the cut grass would jam the paddle gates, causing massive leaks. Then, floodwaters would constantly wash out the aqueducts. On top of that, careless boatmen would lock themselves through and just forget to close the gates, draining entire miles of water in an instant.
And if that wasn't enough, sunken timber and logs deliberately rolled into the channel would pierce the hulls of boats, sinking them right there in the ditch. It was just this rapid-fire domino effect of disasters.
Sabotage and canal warfare. And yet, nature and negligence weren't even the only enemies. We have to introduce an even more shocking obstacle: literal canal warfare. Local Clay County guerrillas viewed the standing timber in the Birch Creek Canal Reservoir as a dangerous health hazard. And when the courts wouldn't stop the construction, well, these citizens decided to take the law into their own hands.
This localized anger quickly escalated into literal armed conflict, known as the Birch Creek Rebellion. Look at how this spiraled. In 1854, a mob cuts a 100-foot gap in the reservoir bank, completely drying up 10 miles of the canal. Then, in May of 1855, 100 armed vandals with blackened faces march in broad daylight, driving away workmen, burning buildings, and wrecking the aqueduct. It got so bad that late in 1855, the governor literally had to dispatch a general, state troops, and 50 armed volunteers from Evansville just to prevent a civil war over infrastructure. No way, right?
The railroads take over. So the crucial point here is, between the floods, the grass, the mosquitoes, and the armed rebellions, the canal was obviously already struggling. But the final nail in its coffin wasn't a broken dam, it was technological obsolescence. The railroads had officially arrived. When you look at the two options side by side, it is obvious why shippers abandoned the water for the rails. Think about it. The canal was strictly seasonal. It was painfully slow. It was halted entirely by winter ice and grounded by summer droughts or spring floods. The railroads, on the other hand, offered year-round operation. They provided high speeds, reliable schedules, and they honestly didn't care at all what the river's water level was. It was a completely unequal fight.
So, let's look at how this all builds into the slow death of a ditch. By 1858, court injunctions forced the closure of the southern portion. In 1859, the state was so incredibly desperate, it leased the entire canal to private groups, basically trying to wash its hands of the whole mess. By 1860, tornadoes and mutineers were wrecking whatever was left. Navigation ceased below Terre Haute in 1861. And finally, in 1876, the entire crumbling, bankrupt, multi-million-dollar project was publicly auctioned off.
Legacy of a ditch. So, what actually happens when a state goes bankrupt, building an enormous 468-mile trench that nobody even uses anymore? Well, the aftermath of this multi-million-dollar project is surprisingly bizarre.
As one newspaper described it at the auction, the old ditch wound like a serpent through the land. Towns just simply drained their sections. Down in Evansville, the stagnant water became such a massive nuisance they ordered the whole thing filled in. In Terre Haute, the canal bed was actually used to construct the city's very first sewer system before being covered up. And get this, other stretches were simply paved over to serve as the right-of-ways for the exact same railroads that had put the canal out of business. I mean, talk about adding insult to injury.
But before we completely write off the Wabash and Erie Canal as a total disaster, consider this final thought. Yes, it nearly bankrupted a state, but the thousands of laborers who came to dig it stayed and bought land. The towns platted along its banks grew. It spurred immigration and economic development that genuinely shaped the Midwest as we know it today. So it leaves us with a pretty fascinating question. Without this massive failure, would the region have ever bloomed? And what massive, controversial infrastructure projects of today might actually be paving the way for our future? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity to dig even deeper into our history.